While we've talked about factors that affect the level of output in an economy, we haven't discussed the factors that affect price. What causes the prices of goods and services to rise? In other words, what causes inflation? Is inflation related to monetary and fiscal policies? And if so, how? Can monetary and fiscal policies control inflation? Inflation is the subject of the next two segments. We'll talk about what causes inflation and then what can be done about it. This is an important part of the course because it's here that we bring together many of the pieces that we've introduced in previous programs. Important principle is that output and the price level are interrelated, so we want to build a model that examines them together. This model is known as the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. It's an important model in macroeconomics because it forms the basis for policy decisions and economic forecasts. We'll construct this model by first considering aggregate demand and then aggregate supply. After we've done this, we'll examine their behavior together, their responses to policy, and finally, the causes and cures of inflation. Keep in mind that this model is not without controversy. We'll try to point this out as we move along. So far, we've only looked at the determination of output using the Keynesian cross model holding the price level fixed. Notice that this fixed price level, P sub 0, is associated with an equilibrium output level, YE sub 0. Now, suppose we just transport that pair of price and equilibrium output to another graph where we have the price level on the vertical axis and output on the horizontal axis. This would give us one point in this PY space. Now, we ask ourselves the question, what happens to equilibrium output if the price level changes? Specifically, if the price level falls to, say, P sub 1, what happens, if anything, to equilibrium output? Does it go up or does it go down? To go about answering this question, ask yourselves, what determined the level of equilibrium output to begin with? Well, it was the level of aggregate expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Only if the level of aggregated expenditures changed did we get a change in equilibrium output. Recall, if aggregate expenditures increased, then firms would observe a decline in desired inventories and so increase production or output to match the higher level of expenditures. So, if the aggregate price level falls, is that going to affect aggregate expenditures? Will that in turn affect equilibrium output? Well, let's look again at our aggregate expenditures and think about what could happen to them if the price level changes. Let's begin with consumption. If the price level drops, would consumption change? Well, what determines consumption? Recall the major determinants were income, wealth, interest rates, and expectation. Income was explicitly modeled in our consumption function. The rest of the factors were lumped into autonomous consumption. Let's look at these autonomous components because if they change, consumption will change and so will aggregate expenditure. So at a lower price level, does household wealth increase? Household wealth consists of such items as property, stocks, bonds, and savings accounts. If wealth increases, consumption goes up. If wealth decreases, consumption goes down. Given the price level falls, what happens to household wealth? Well, it depends. For example, if you have a savings account, a lower price level means that your wealth can purchase more in real terms, and so consumption would go up. However, if your wealth is held in property, such as a house, then if the value of your house falls more than the decline in the aggregate price level, your real wealth would decrease and so would consumption. If the value of your house decreases by the same amount as the aggregate price level, your real wealth would remain unchanged. Now, what's the net effect of changes in the price level on household wealth and so consumption? Generally, it appears that when the price level falls, there is a net increase in real wealth and so consumption would go up. This relationship between the aggregate price level, real wealth, and consumption is known as the real wealth or balance effect. In sum, a fall in the aggregate price level would lead to an increase in the level of autonomous consumption via changes in real wealth. Next, we consider the effect of a fall in the aggregate price level on investment. What factors determine the level of investment? The most important factors were the interest rate and expected profits. Now, how does price level influence these? Well, think linkage. If the price level falls, what happens to the interest rate? Remember, interest rates are determined in the money market. So, if the price level falls, what happens in the money market? A decline in the aggregate price level leads to a decrease in the transactions demand for money. The transactions demand for money is the money demanded for purposes of making transactions, that is, for buying things. A fall in the demand for money causes a fall in the rate of interest. If the interest rate falls, then the level of investment and so also the level of consumption increases. In sum, a lower price level results in higher levels of consumption and investment. So what? Remember, we are trying to show what happens to equilibrium output when the aggregate price level falls. Now we can see that when the price level falls, consumption and investment increase. The higher level of aggregate expenditures results in a decrease in the desired level of inventories by firms. In response to this, firms expand their production to match the higher level of aggregate expenditures, and so equilibrium output increases. This is shown on the graph. Aggregate demand is in a schedule that relates the price level to expenditures. At every point on the aggregate demand schedule, the goods market, meaning our Keynesian cross model, and the money market are in equilibrium. Or every point, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m, and money demand is equal to money supply. The shifts in the aggregate demand curve will occur any time equilibrium output, and so aggregate expenditures changes, holding the price level fixed. In fact, we have done this already in our Keynesian cross model and are only transporting these relationships to a different graph. For example, if there's an increase in the supply of money owing to expansionary monetary policy, the interest rate will fall and the level of investment and consumption will rise. This increase in aggregate expenditures will increase the equilibrium level of output at every price level by the amount of the multiplier times the change in autonomous expenditures. Simply put, the aggregate demand curve shifts. Now we can look at the aggregate demand curve and ask, if consumption, investment, government spending, exports, or imports changes, will that cause the equilibrium level of output to go up or down? The answer tells you what way to shift aggregate demand. At this point, we have an aggregate demand model that tells us a schedule of equilibrium levels of output for each given price. Now, suppose we want to examine what happens in the economy when the government follows a contractionary policy. We want to be able to predict what happens to output and the price level. In order to say output has gone up or the price level has gone down, we need to have a reference point. In other words, where was the economy before the government implemented a different policy? This is analogous to the problem, if I ask you how to get to Temple Square in Salt Lake City, you need to know where I am before you can tell me where to go. So, we have to figure out where our economy is. Since everywhere on the aggregate demand schedule is an equilibrium point, we need to pick one of them out. Should we pick one out at random? Well, that would be nice, but not very rational. If we knew what the price level was, then we would automatically be able to find the corresponding equilibrium output level. We need to bring in more information into the model to determine the prevailing price level. Well, let's introduce the aggregate supply curve. The aggregate supply curve is more aptly described as a price-output response curve, which tells us how much the aggregate price level responds to increases in output. In effect, we're asking the question, when firms collectively are faced with an increase in demand, do they produce more output or raise the price or some combination of both? It's this relationship that underlies the aggregate supply curve. Let's see how it works. To consider the price-output response function, we have to ask ourselves under what conditions would the firm raise prices in response to an increase in demand instead of increasing production. Well, this is not a trivial question because within the United States economy, there's a range of industrial structures from perfect competition where firms are price takers to monopolies where firms are price makers. Each of these may have different reactions to an increase in demand for their products. In addition, if collectively the demand for goods and services rises as represented by an increase in aggregate demand, then there's a collective increase in the demand for inputs to the production process, namely labor. If this is the case, then the price of labor may rise with an increase in aggregate demand, and firms would have to consider these higher costs in their output pricing decisions. Given these important factors, industrial structure and the behavior of input prices, particularly wages, can we say anything about the general response of prices to increase in the level of output? Of course we can. Whether it makes any sense or not is another story. But let's begin at one output price level given by P sub 0 and Y sub 0. Pick Y sub 0 so that it is at the level far below the productive capacity of the economy. If the economy is actually at this point, we could assume it is because the level of aggregate demand is determining this particular level of output for the price level P sub 0. Now suppose aggregate demand increases bit by bit in tiny amounts. These equal incremental increases in aggregate demand signify that households, firms, the government, and the foreign sectors would like to increase their expenditures in these incremental units at the existing price level. In fact, if the price level doesn't change, then we are tracing an output price response curve or aggregate supply curve that's horizontal. In other words, increases in demand are met by equivalent increases in output with no change in the price level. In this case, we are assuming that firms have access to a ready supply of inputs at existing input prices. As firms collectively purchase more inputs to produce more output, nothing happens to input prices or productivity. So per unit costs of production remain unchanged, and so per unit output prices remain unchanged. Now let's do this again. However, this time we assume that our firms cannot increase production because plant capacity and labor are fully utilized. In other words, the economy is on the production possibility frontier. We are at full employment. So any incremental increases in aggregate demand cannot be matched by any increases in production. Why? Because there's no physical capacity left to produce more. If demand for output of all firms collectively increases, then all firms collectively require more labor. But if labor is already fully employed, firms simply bid labor away from each other, driving up wages. As the costs of production go up, firms raise output prices. As a result, collectively, firms raise the price level in response to higher aggregate demand. The situation is like robbing Peter to pay Paul. The output level does not increase. In fact, it can't because the economy is at full employment. In this case, the price output response curve or aggregate supply curve is vertical. Notice some of the crucial differences between a horizontal aggregate supply curve and a vertical aggregate supply curve. A horizontal aggregate supply curve assumes that output can increase without increases in the cost of production, so the price level remains fixed. A vertical aggregate supply curve assumes that output cannot increase, so increases in aggregate demand are matched by higher prices to offset increases in production costs. This gives us an idea. The slope of the price-output response or aggregate supply curve depends a lot upon what happens to costs of production as aggregate demand increases. This, however, raises a question. How much slack is there in the economy? The greater the slack or excess capacity, the less likely we are to see production costs increase in response to increases in aggregate demand. As the economy approaches full employment, slack in the economy decreases. So we're more likely to see greater increases in production costs, and so increases in the price level in response to higher levels of aggregate demand. This gives us an aggregate supply curve that's relatively flat at low levels of output and becomes steeper as the output level approaches full employment or the capacity level. When drawing the aggregate supply curve, one needs to note on the horizontal axis where capacity output occurs, because here the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. Notice that along the aggregate supply curve, input prices are changing in response to the higher levels of aggregate demand. It is the increase in production costs owing to a collective demand for more inputs that pushes up the price level. This differs from the supply curve for an individual firm. For an individual firm, wages and input prices appear fixed. The upward slope in the firm's supply curve arises from diminishing returns. As more labor is hired, assuming a fixed plant size, labor productivity falls, which results in higher production costs. An aggregate supply curve will shift if changes occur in production costs caused by factors other than higher aggregate demand. If costs of production increase, then at every output level, the aggregate price level will increase to cover these higher costs. The aggregate supply curve will decrease or shift leftward. For any given level of output, the price level is higher. This appears as an upward shift in the aggregate supply curve. What are some factors or events that can systematically change costs of production? Some of the important ones include oil prices, because oil is an important energy input in the economy, wages, which can adjust in response to higher prices, the productivity of inputs, which affects costs of production, and tax policies, which can increase or decrease the cost of production. Now, all of our discussion on aggregate demand and aggregate supply is really pushing us to ask how the price level and output level are simultaneously determined in an economy. Bringing together aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we notice there's a unique point where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. This point is the price-output combination that corresponds to equilibrium in the goods market, equilibrium in the money market, and equilibrium in the input market. From here, we can begin to understand how the economy works, how it responds to shocks, and what are some of the causes and cures of inflation. In our next segment, we'll look at the complete aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to examine these questions. In our last program, we ended up with an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model that determined the equilibrium output and price level in the economy. We would like to examine the issues of monetary and fiscal policy as well as inflation. First, however, we need to consider one more aspect of aggregate supply, or what happens in the long run. The long run really isn't a time period such as days, weeks, or months. Instead, it's defined as having occurred once price and wages fully adjust to changes in the price level initiated by a change in aggregate demand. Let's begin with an example. Suppose the economy is at equilibrium at point 1. We're going to locate this equilibrium at an output level called potential output. Potential output is that output level corresponding to full employment. Or we can think of it as an output level that can be sustained without changing the price level. Now, what happens if aggregate demand increases? Given our aggregate supply, we might perhaps see that output increases along with some increase in the price level. This seems fine until you begin to think about it. Is this position stable? Or are there forces in the economy that may cause this position to change? Let's think about labor. Initially, at point 1, with a price level of 100, workers may have been receiving a nominal wage of $10 per hour. This would give them a real wage of $10 divided by 100 times 100, or $10 per hour. As aggregate demand increases, some workers may receive a higher nominal wage as the demand for labor goes up. Other workers may have wage contracts and so are stuck at $10 per hour. Let's assume, for simplicity, that all labor's wage is stuck at $10 per hour because of contracts. Okay, more workers get hired as aggregate demand goes up. But what's happening to the purchasing power of labor? At point 2, the price level is also higher, implying that the purchasing power of labor has fallen. If the price level at point 2 was 110, then the real wage of labor would be $10 per hour divided by 110 times 100, and that's $9.09 per hour. This is not a happy situation. Workers have experienced a decline in their purchasing power. Once they can do something about it, workers will bid up their nominal wages to compensate for the higher price level. However, as they do this, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. This process will occur until workers are completely compensated for the higher price levels. ultimately the process ends at a level of output consistent with the amount of labor workers want to supply at a given real wage, which was $10 per hour. After this adjustment process, the economy would be at point 3 with a nominal wage of, say, $12 and a price level of $1.20. This would give workers a real wage of $10, which is exactly where they were at the beginning. Notice, at this level of potential output, there is no tendency for workers to ask for higher nominal wages since they are receiving a real wage consistent with the labor supply that produces the potential level of output. So the long run occurs at point 3, where wages have fully adjusted to the increase in the price level brought about by the change in aggregate demand. This adjustment process can take a long time or occur even at the mere hint that the price level is going to go up. It's not a matter of chronological time, but rather a matter of how fast wages and other costs adjust to the higher price level. If we had begun our example at point 3 and allowed aggregate demand to fall and the economy moved to point 4, then we would be in a theoretical situation where at point 4, the fall in the price level resulted in a higher real wage, say $12 divided by 110 times 100, which is $10.90 instead of $10. However, at point 4, the economy is operating below potential output. This means that there exists unemployment in the labor market. If wages are fully flexible, the unemployment would lead to a decline in the nominal wage. But as nominal wages fall, aggregate supply increases until we are again at potential output with a price level of 100 and a nominal wage of $10. This again results in a real wage of $10, and so there's no tendency to change. Point 1 is therefore a long-run position because wages and costs have fully adjusted to the lower price level. The long-run aggregate supply curve can therefore be considered that at that level of output towards which the economy kind of gravitates if wages and costs adjust to changes in the aggregate price level. Now, how long it takes to reach the long-run position depends upon the speed of adjustment of wages and prices. The faster the adjustment process, the faster is the long-run position attained. Given our aggregate demand and supply model, let's examine what happens to the price level when there's either policy shifts or exogenous changes affecting aggregate demand and or aggregate supply. Consider an economy at an initial equilibrium at point 1. One might conclude that anything that increases aggregate demand, such as expansionary fiscal or monetary policies, would have the same results in the economy, namely higher output and aggregate price levels in the short run and higher price levels in the long run. However, one needs to be a bit more analytical when comparing different policies. Consider first an expansionary monetary policy. Increases in the money supply result in a decline in the rate of interest, leading to an increase in the level of investment, and so an increase in aggregate demand. In the short run, this would result in a higher level of output and some upward pressure on the price level if the economy were initially at full employment. The higher output and price level will raise money demand somewhat and so moderate the fall in interest rates. The increase in output due to an expansionary monetary policy is composed primarily of higher investment and consumption spending. Eventually, the higher price level leads to an increase in wages and other costs of production, and so the aggregate supply curve begins to shift left until the long-run position is reached. The long-run effect is an increase in the price level. Consider next expansionary fiscal policy. Increases in government spending or cuts in taxes result in an increase in aggregate demand. As output and the price level or nominal GDP go up, so does the demand for money. As money demand increases, so does the interest rate. And the higher interest rate decreases investment and consumption spending, which offsets some of the policy's expansionary effects. The higher level of output is composed of increases in government and household spending. Eventually, the higher price level leads to an adjustment of wages and costs until aggregate supply moves to a long-run equilibrium position where output is back at potential output and the price level is higher. Notice that the difference between fiscal and monetary policy has more to do with the effects each has on the composition of output between C, I, and G, rather than on the general movement of output and the price level. In fact, notice that both of these policies resulted in a higher price level. Should we conclude that expansionary monetary and fiscal policies will always cause inflation? Well, look again at our model. What was causing inflation is the fact that 1. Aggregate supply had an upward slope in the region where aggregate demand was increasing, and 2. The higher price level resulted in further adjustments of wages and costs until aggregate supply shifted up to a new long-run equilibrium position. Well, what would have happened if the economy was initially at an output level far below full employment, say at point 1? In this case, any increase in aggregate demand would put no upward pressure on the price level because there is excess capacity in the economy. If the aggregate price level does not change, then there is no need for further adjustments in wages and costs. The long-run equilibrium position may not be obtainable automatically. Does this imply there's a role for active monetary and fiscal policy to pull the economy out of a recession? And does this imply that there may be situations where adjustments in wages and prices by themselves will not return the economy to full employment? Now let's consider what happens if there's a shock to aggregate supply. If any of you remember the oil shocks of the 1970s, you will have experienced a recession created by a systematic decrease in aggregate supply. If not, you'll have to look at our graph. Notice that we are beginning at full employment equilibrium at position 1. Suppose an oil shock occurs such there's a decrease in aggregate supply. This would result in a decline in output and increases in the price level, which is illustrated by position 2. At the short-run equilibrium position, we have both inflation and a recession. This situation is called stagflation. Some economists say that if we leave the economy alone, eventually the excess capacity and unemployment in the economy will result in a decrease in wages and prices, shifting aggregate supply down until we reach full employment. But wait a second. For workers, the increase in the price level has already reduced real wages. In effect, the country has lost income because income has flown to the oil-producing countries to pay for the higher-priced oil. It may not be reasonable to expect wages to fall that quickly given this situation. However, if wages are flexible, then achieving full employment equilibrium is only a matter of time. Now, if you don't believe wages are flexible, you might think it time for expansionary monetary or fiscal policy to pull us out of the recession. However, both of these would result in additional increases in the price level and so more inflation. But more inflation might mean that workers want higher nominal wages and so further decreases in aggregate supply and more inflation. Well, this doesn't look good. In fact, it wasn't a very pleasant time. Well, what else to do? It's times like these that force people to consider and try new things, and here's where supply-side economics found an audience. The idea was to attempt to fashion government policies to reduce costs of production and so increase short-run aggregate supply. This would pull the economy out of the recession in an anti-inflationary way. Well, what policies were these? Well, they cut taxes on businesses, deregulate business, reduce environmental standards, become less supportive of unions. Does this sound familiar? It was the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s. Did it work? Well, that's another issue. So now we've seen that inflation for one period or several periods can occur because of changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In fact, we classify inflation often by its sources: demand pull, cost push, or expectations driven. What is this expectation stuff? The idea is that if you expect inflation, you behave in a way that causes inflation. For example, if the economy were at full employment and you heard the Fed was going to increase the growth in the money supply to try to keep the economy above full employment, what would you do? Well, you might immediately begin to bargain for a higher wage because you would expect the price level to be rising. But in bargaining for a higher wage, costs of production rise and so does inflation, before the Fed even got to cause it directly themselves. We'll look at more applications of aggregate demand and aggregate supply models in terms of economic history in another segment.